Welcome, everybody, to this afternoon talk on HIPAA-like privacy law that's coming close to you in a serious game environment in the near future. I've actually been attending the conference all week. My name is Leslie Gruss. I was a mathematician for the Department of Defense for 30 years. I have a long-standing interest in privacy, and I have just published a book on privacy, which is available on Amazon. It was published by Academica Press. So I'm going to take what I've learned about privacy through work and through the research for my book, and I'm going to talk a little bit about privacy and how it's going to start applying to serious games more in the future. So I'd like to start with a story. This past winter, before we were all sequestered in our homes, my husband and I attended the 2020 Consumer Electronics Show, which I had been wanting to do forever. So everybody should probably go to the Consumer Electronics Show once just to have the experience. Plus, it's in Vegas. So if you love Vegas, what's not to love, right? So anyway, we are wandering around with 250,000 of our closest friends, because that's how big this conference is, and it's scattered across the Las Vegas Convention Center and several hotels. We're looking around like the bumpkins that have come to the big city, and we came to this staircase. And so I poked my husband and I said, "Look at that." I said, "Look, there's a vendor that thinks it's a good idea to get private individuals to give them their DNA. And presumably they're getting some freebie with having shared their DNA." I said, "That doesn't seem like a very good privacy idea to me." And so we started talking about that. My husband's also a mathematician, but he's also a psychologist. And he said, "You know, it's kind of like that scene in Jurassic Park." And I said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "Remember the scene where the mathematician," you know, it's always the mathematician, right? Because we're the troublemakers. The mathematician goes to Jurassic Park for the first time, and he meets the designer, who is starry-eyed even though he's older, and just overwhelmed by the potential of what one might do by creating living dinosaurs. And the mathematician, played by Jeff Goldblum, of course, whose name is Dr. Ian Malcolm, looks at the creator of Jurassic Park and says, "Just because you can doesn't mean you should. In other words, just because you have the technology to make living dinosaurs doesn't mean it's a good idea." And so I think that kind of applies here. Just because you can collect somebody's DNA and monetize it, right? Make it useful as information to someone else, doesn't mean that you should. It's not necessarily a good idea when it comes to things like privacy concerns. Of course, the converse is also true. Just because you should doesn't mean you can. In other words, the technology is there, and there may be a business case for doing this, but it doesn't mean the law is on your side. So what we're going to talk about today are ideas like this. So here I've made you a quick synopsis. All these acronyms are laws or regulations. Most of them are US based. One is European. So I'm going to talk about these a little bit. I'm not going to read slides to you. That's just insulting. So I want to talk about why we're here. Why are we here? The basic thesis for why we're all here is because we're all interested in serious games. Serious games are about helping people. As we're trying to help people, to educate them, to teach them, we're finding that more human information is being integrated into gameplay. Now, why is that? Well, you all would tell me, if you were an audience sitting there speaking back to me, that it's to enhance the learning experience. Well, that's a really interesting idea. And as a technologist, it's a fascinating thought, just like the creator of Jurassic Park thought it was a fascinating thought to make an island of living dinosaurs. But what we're starting to see is traditional information that was protected as medical information or clinical information is starting to migrate into other venues. And these other venues are educational venues or experiential learning venues. And so what we're going to start to see in the future is some of the traditional laws, regulations, and ideas about the privacy of your information are going to start having more bearing on serious games. So let's start with the first law we're going to look at. For non-US based people, HIPAA, or the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, was the first law in the United States passed in 1996 to protect health information. And at that point in time, after this law was passed and signed, out of it came some regulation. There was a privacy rule that came into effect, and there was a security rule. And they cover all the things you think of when you think about privacy and security. The privacy of the information concerning your health, services, payments, and so on. Security, that whoever holds your information is going to keep it safe. So why do I mention this? Well, let's think about a scenario, a potential scenario here. Suppose I hook a patient up. I'm a doctor or a clinician. I'm a doctor or clinician, and I hook a patient up for an EEG to an EEG headset. Now, why would I do that? Well, there's a good medical reason for that. If you're Leslie, you have a sleep disorder and they need to diagnose it so they know how to treat you. So they hook all these electrodes up to your scalp with lots of gooey stuff. And what they're going to do is record the electrical information in your brain. So by recording this information, they're able to diagnose if you have a sleep problem, or they might use it for somebody who has seizures in order to diagnose the source of the seizures. And then it also turns out there's a correlation between seizures and autism. So now we're sort of starting to move from the strictly physical medical environment to the psychological environment here. So if you were me and my husband, John, wandering around the Consumer Electronics Show, there were about a bazillion vendors showing headsets like the one in this picture for kids. Primarily for kids, also for grown-ups, but a lot for kids. So what does this say? Well, the reason they're marketing these headsets is, one, because they're intended to help kids with things like ADHD or special learning needs that they might have. Also at the Consumer Electronics Show, we saw similar headsets and more sophisticated VR headsets that were intended to help treat things like addiction. So what's interesting about this is, as opposed to the medical EEG devices, which are very expensive, and the testing is very expensive, and it requires expertise in order to conduct the testing, these have a price point of, say, a couple $100, and you don't need any great deal of expertise in order to use it. You basically pop it on your head, you pair it up with whatever the app is, and whiz bang, away you go. Well, that's interesting. So from an educational point of view, there were vendors at the Consumer Electronics Show that showed these headsets being used in the educational classroom. Okay, now your bells should be going off about privacy. So the way that some vendors marketed this was these headsets, if every student wore one, that the teacher could measure the level of engagement among her students by reading the brain activity of every student. Now, that's a really interesting idea, but that also raises some really serious privacy concerns once you take a device like this outside of the medical setting or the clinical setting or the privacy of a person's home. So let's look at that a little bit more. There was a reference in an earlier talk this morning to both HIPAA and COPPA. So COPPA, that is a US law passed in 1998 that talks about protecting children under 13 online. And what the basic rule says is that whoever gives access to children to online activities has to protect the privacy and the security of the child. And also, before the child can engage with the online activity, they have to obtain prior parental consent for kids under 13. So what does that mean? Well, what it means is there are some vendors out there that have run amok of this law and have been brought up on charges by the government. So one case I'm going to talk to, and there are many, but the one case I'll talk to about today is the COPPA complaint against TikTok, which was known formerly as Musical.ly. So you see there's a little girl there on the right who's on TikTok. I just captured this off a public screen that was readily available. She may be older than 13 or younger than 13. I don't know. She's trying to look older than 13, definitely. So what happened? It turned out that TikTok, for the first 3 years of its existence, gave accounts to anybody without asking what their age was. After that, they started giving accounts to children once a child themselves verified that they were over or they were 13 or older. Now, I don't know how many 13-year-olds you know or youngers than 13s that you know, but if a kid is intent on using an app, there's very little that will stand in the way of them getting to that app. So not lying about their age is not going to be a problem, or lying about their age is not going to be a problem for them. So what happened is there was a complaint filed against TikTok. The regulator in charge is the Federal Trade Commission here. Federal Trade Commission, FTC, has a big consumer privacy effort. And what happened as a result of the complaint is that they had to pay a $5.7 million penalty in February of 2019, and they had to start adopting more compliant practices to protect the children under 13 that were using the application. So the lesson you should take away here is if you are marketing a product that may be used by children in the United States under 13, you better think about COPPA compliance because you don't want to end up like TikTok. So now at this point in time, you all are saying, wow, this is a dizzying array of information. I have no idea how to get my hands around this. And fair enough, it is very confusing and complicated, and the rules vary from country to country, and it looks like state to state right now in the US. So if you really kind of want to understand what motivates this whole discussion, you'd probably want to go back and read this book from 1973. So this was a report that was put out by the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, HEW, which was subsequently broken up in the United States to HHS, Department of Education, and some other bits and pieces. But the important thing to take away here was the idea of FIPS, Fair Information Practices. You'll find people talking about FIPS all over the place. Sometimes they spell them with one P, sometimes they spell them with two P's. It's very confusing, so you need to pin them down. But the basic ideas here are valid. So these were the original 5 FIPS. And there's nothing especially surprising here. In fact, it sort of seems, that first one seems kind of antiquated, right? About not having secret record keeping. But remember, this is a product of the era. The second one, being able to know about what information is held in a record and how it's used. And then preventing its reuse, correcting and amending the information, and ensuring the protection and the reliability and preventing the misuse of the information. These are the fundamental ideas under all privacy rules, laws. There's a few more buzzwords we'll come across here. What happened as a result of these FIPS was in 1974, the U.S. Privacy Act was passed. And the U.S. Privacy Act broadly outlined 8 FIPS. And I'm not going to talk about that today, but this is just sort of a story of the chronology and history of how we kind of got here. So let's talk about what was happening over in Europe. So in Europe today, we're all worrying about the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, originally passed by the EU in 2016 and went into effect in 2018. Now, the GDPR actually is a lot broader than those original FIPS that I just showed you. But remember, the FIPS I showed you, they were kind of the starting point in the US. And the GDPR has the benefit of being several decades later and sort of being the current state of the discussion of privacy. So GDPR very broadly applies to both the public and the private sector. That's different than the way we do privacy in the US so far. We have done sectoral privacy law, one sector at a time, having to do with things like banking, education, health information, and so on. The GDPR also includes things like online IDs and location information. Now you see why I picked the topic or the title that I picked today, right? Things like the online IDs and the location information that you shared as a Pokemon Go player would be protected under GDPR. Things like biological data are especially protected. So if you have EEG headset information, that is biological data information. And if that is being shared with someone else, that is protected. Okay, many of the other ideas are similar to things we saw before in FIPS. I will draw your attention to the right to be forgotten. So we've all kind of laughed about the right to be forgotten because as a technologist, this one is very, the word I guess I'd use would be aspirational, right? If you, as a European consumer, decide that there's information about you that you don't want to be held in a data repository, then you can petition to have that removed. But that also implies that any other places that data might have propagated or gotten shared with needs to forget that information too. That is a daunting technical problem. Very interesting, ripe area for research right now. There's one other thing about the GDPR which I didn't fully appreciate until I had spent a lot of time thinking about privacy for my book. And this point is made in other books, so I don't think I'm off base by making this comment here. The GDPR is very focused on the protection of human autonomy and freedom. Now, for people in the US, as Americans, we say, well, yeah, we value freedom of action, and we value our autonomy, sure. But see, Europe lived through a different kind of series of events than we did. For example, many of the people in Europe lived through World War II, or their families lived through World War II. There were cases where Nazi Germany abridged the rights of individuals, where human autonomy was not relevant, where people were thrown in concentration camps and executed. Okay, this is very live and real to them in a way it is not live and real to people in the United States. Okay, it's also very live and real in Eastern Europe and in Russia, because many of those people and their families lived through Stalin's Soviet Russia, where once again, there were major purges, people were sent to relocation centers and work centers, people were executed, okay? All the human rights, the basic human rights that people have were abridged. So if you go back in history in the GDPR, it actually makes reference to the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which was signed, ratified in 1948. It's very important to understand that this is some of what motivates the ideas and the thoughts in Europe. Okay, today we're starting to see that as well as we look at what the commercial world is doing with private information. And even here in the United States, we're starting to question whether our private information should be better protected to enable our freedom of choice when we go, for example, shopping. So let's move on. So where are we at the state level? Probably everybody here has heard of the California Consumer Privacy Act. This was signed into law in 2018. It became active in 2020. And as you can see, it's the most comprehensive privacy law we have in the US right now concerning the internet. It is the model in the US. And being, of course, California, it's pretty strict, okay? Just like the GDPR, the California law gives a broad definition to what information is included. It gives people access to the personal information about themselves. It has something like this right to be forgotten that GDPR talks about. And there is also data security, also something we've seen before. One other feature that I didn't make it to the slide is the private right to private action. And this is one of those sticking points that we're going to have. Private right to private action means that an individual can file a civil suit against a company to try to get damages awarded. And there will be, as you see, a big debate about this when it comes to the federal law. California is not the only state that's been thinking about privacy law. There are several other states that are considering privacy legislation. That includes states like New York, Maryland, Massachusetts, Hawaii, North Dakota, Illinois, and Utah. Now, of course, if you are a vendor and you're looking at this landscape of consumer privacy law and you're saying, oh my God, I'm just a little company. And yet every single state is going to be passing its own privacy act, privacy law. What am I ever going to do? Some vendors say the best solution would be a federal privacy law. So right now, amongst all the other crises we seem to be having at the moment, there have been multiple privacy bills proposed in Congress. 9 in the Senate, 2 in the House. And these privacy bills all share similar attributes to things we've talked about before. There are a few other keywords that we haven't encountered before, but we still see the same broad definition of personal data. We still see the same individual rights to access, control, and delete information about ourselves. We encounter this funny word, transparency, which is very au courant in government circles. It means that citizens should have visibility into what is being done to their information with the algorithms. Another phrase we haven't encountered before, although it is incorporated in other laws and rules we've talked about before, is data minimization. Data minimization means if you're a vendor, you should only ask your consumer for the minimum amount of information required in order to accomplish the task. Furthermore, it implicitly suggests that that data needs to be transmitted no further than the immediate vicinity for which it was requested. In other words, it kind of implicitly restricts you from sharing it with other people. You'll see the privacy bills also touch upon this private right for action for consumers. This is a big sticking point. And then another huge sticking point as we work through this privacy legislation question is whether the federal law will preempt state laws. For example, the federal government may choose to pass a privacy law that is not as strict as the California Consumer Privacy Act. In which case, if that federal law is designed so it doesn't preempt state law, then that higher bar of privacy that California established with its law applies in the state of California. So my prediction, given everything that's going on, is I'm hopeful that we will see federal privacy legislation in 2021. So what's interesting about this is you see from the east side of the Atlantic, the European privacy law, GDPR, that regulation, is pushing Washington towards federal privacy legislation so that there's a better match between US and European privacy rules. It's intended to expedite trade, commerce, things like that. On the other hand, we see from the West Coast, California Consumer Privacy Act is pushing Washington to act because all those people in the commercial world are talking to their lobbyists and saying, wow, I don't want 50 different privacy laws to have to adhere to in the United States. I just want one federal privacy law. So Washington is being squeezed from both directions to act. So that's why I'm optimistic that in the next year, maybe two, we will see federal privacy legislation. So what do we conclude here? I started out by saying we're all here because we're all interested in serious games. We're all interested about doing good in the world and helping people. We're finding that we are integrating more human information into our gameplay in order to enhance the learning experience. But on the other hand, we're seeing at the state level, the national level, and even the international level, there's an increased emphasis on privacy. As the Europeans rightly observe, protecting privacy is about protecting human autonomy and freedom. If you read the fabulous book by Shoshana Zuboff called Surveillance Capitalism, she makes a long argument about this and talks about how important freedom is to democracy. I highly recommend the book. It's a little rough going, it's a little long, but well worthwhile. And finally, protecting privacy is about protecting your company, right? If you have a burgeoning interest in serious games, you need to be thinking from the very start about the risks associated with private information. Because otherwise, bad things can happen to you and your company. You can end up being fined by the government and the EU. You can end up being fined through awards that are made under civil suits. Your reputation can be damaged. You can lose revenue. In some cases, the CEO, the CIO, all the senior executives, some of them at least, can end up going to jail. And in the worst case scenario, of course, you go bankrupt. So you need to think about privacy up front. With that remark, I'll conclude. Here's the cover of my book. It talks a lot about this history in detail, and I'd be happy to take any questions people have now.
There is a question in the chat. Does it prevent them from selling their information? That was from James.
So that's a really tricky question right now. So there is no pat answer there. It depends on the privacy agreement, the privacy notice. Obviously, the really big players in the internet arena, the people like Google and Facebook and all those other animals at the zoo, those are the ones that the regulators are going to go after. So if your company is getting big enough that you're starting to be concerned about these kinds of things, you need to have a privacy attorney, at least on retainer, to help you. I would say privacy notices at this point in time, I don't know that they're really enforceable. I think the Federal Trade Commission has managed to enforce privacy notices when they've been big players, but I can't answer whether a violation of a privacy notice per se would be prosecutable if you were a smaller player.
Another question that came in is, do you also need to be careful about what information you buy?
Information you buy, like what? Do you mean like a copyright violation, or what do you mean by that? Or do you mean products I buy?
Personal details. So the information that's been collected and someone buys that information from another company.
So I know there are a lot of apps out there if you want to do like a credit check, if you want to check somebody's criminal history. I know there are a lot of apps out there that allow you to do that. Again, if I were concerned about the reputation and revenues of a company, I would have a lawyer on retainer so you could ask them the question, what is the acceptable way to get this information that won't get me in trouble? I am not a lawyer, I am just a mathematician.
Okay, so another question was, can the GDPR be forced on US-based websites?
The GDPR applies to the private information of all EU citizens. So as I understand it, and I am not a GDPR attorney, as I understand it, if you sell products to a European, then their information is protected. Any other questions?
Yes. Libraries already protect privacy of user information. Are you familiar with any games designed with library users and what they might have done with regards to privacy of the user, especially when games often have interaction by different groups of people?
So I would worry less about libraries. Libraries have very little commercial reason to want to sell or reuse your information, unless, of course, the librarian is evil. But let's assume not. Libraries are often associated with schools. So schools will have attorneys on staff. Schools have reputations. Schools have revenues. The library needs to be aware of doing things by the book when it comes to privacy. The people I would worry about are really the commercial world, the Googles and the Facebooks out there that are collecting, reusing, analyzing, selling, sharing, et cetera, all your private information, basically to get you to buy other products. And again, Shoshana Zuboff's book on surveillance capitalism is a great read on this subject.
Okay, how do you buy your book?
It's available on Amazon.
Great. A lot of kudos for you,
Thank you.
Leslie.
Please get in touch if there's anything I can help you with. I'm always interested to hear about where the world of serious games is going. I'm not hearing a lot about privacy yet, but you guys should be thinking about it.
Thank you so much, Leslie.
Sure. Bye.